Walk into any room where decisions are being made and you'll notice something. The loudest voice rarely holds the most power. There's always someone who speaks less, who waits while others rush to fill the silence, who listens with an intensity that makes their eventual words land with disproportionate weight. Machiavelli observed this in the courts of Renaissance Italy, where a single well-timed silence could shift the balance of power more effectively than an hour of eloquent argument. But here's what makes this unsettling. We've been taught the opposite. We've been conditioned to believe that influence comes from speaking up, that leadership means having the most to say, that silence is emptiness rather than strategy. So what happens when you discover that the real power in any room belongs not to those who dominate the conversation, but to those who control it through absence? We're terrified of silence. You can see it everywhere. In meetings where people talk just to fill space, in social gatherings where uncomfortable pauses trigger nervous laughter and desperate small talk, in negotiations where the first person to speak after a proposal usually loses. We've built an entire culture around the fear of quiet. Silence has become synonymous with awkwardness, with failure to connect, with social incompetence. We train ourselves from childhood to fill every gap in conversation, to have something ready to say, to never let the air go still. The modern professional world makes it worse. We reward those who contribute vocally in meetings, who have quick answers, who can think out loud and fill time with words. We've confused activity with productivity, noise with value, constant communication with actual influence. And in doing so, we've forgotten what every master strategist knows. Silence isn't the absence of power. It's the most concentrated form of it. That's where our understanding begins, in the realization that every word you speak is a piece of information you give away, and every moment of silence is an opportunity to gather information others are frantically handing you. Machiavelli didn't write extensively about silence in The Prince, but his entire philosophy rests on it. Observe more than you reveal. Listen more than you speak. Let others expose their positions while you remain unreadable. He watched how power moved through the Medici court, how alliances formed and collapsed, how the rulers who survived longest were those who mastered the art of strategic opacity. They didn't broadcast their intentions. They didn't feel compelled to fill every silence with their thoughts. They understood that in any interaction, the person who reveals less controls more. Because when you're silent, others project onto you. They fill your silence with their assumptions, their fears, their hopes. And in doing so, they tell you everything you need to know about how to influence them. But this goes deeper than simple strategy. Jung understood that our relationship with silence reflects our relationship with ourselves. People who cannot tolerate quiet in a room usually cannot tolerate quiet in their own minds. The compulsive talker isn't just filling external silence. They're running from internal silence, from the discomfort of being alone with their thoughts, from the parts of themselves that emerge when the noise stops. This is why silence feels threatening. It forces confrontation with what we've been avoiding. When you sit in a room and resist the urge to speak, when you let the pause extend past the point of comfort, you're not just employing a tactic. You're facing your own shadow. That part of you that believes your worth is measured by your verbal contribution, that fears being forgotten if you're not constantly reminding people you exist, that equates silence with invisibility. The person who can sit comfortably in silence while others squirm has integrated something most people spend their lives running from: the understanding that they don't need to perform to have value. Think about the last important meeting you attended. Professional, personal, doesn't matter. Try to remember not what was said, but the silences. Who spoke first after a difficult question was asked? Who filled the uncomfortable pauses? Who seemed most eager to demonstrate their engagement through constant verbal contribution? Now think about who actually influenced the outcome. Chances are, it wasn't the person who talked the most. It was the person who spoke selectively, who let others exhaust their positions before offering a perspective, who used silence to create space for others to reveal information they hadn't intended to share. This is the Machiavellian insight that makes people uncomfortable. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every interaction involves a transfer of power, and the person who needs to fill silence is already negotiating from weakness. Here's what most people don't understand. Silence creates pressure, and pressure reveals truth. When you ask a question and then simply wait, without rushing to fill the pause or soften the directness with additional words, something fascinating happens. The other person feels compelled to fill that silence, and in their compulsion, they often say more than they intended, reveal more than they planned, expose vulnerabilities they meant to conceal. This isn't manipulation, it's simply understanding human psychology. We're wired to interpret silence as judgment, as disapproval, as a gap that needs filling. So we fill it, we elaborate, we justify, we offer information we didn't need to offer, make concessions we didn't need to make, all to ease the discomfort of being witnessed in silence. The person who can resist this urge, who can sit calmly in the pressure they've created, gains access to a level of information that the compulsive speaker never reaches. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of appearing one way while being another, of maintaining a public face that serves your interests regardless of your private reality. But what he understood implicitly, what most readers miss, is that silence is the ultimate expression of this principle. When you're silent, people cannot pin down your position. They cannot find the edges of your thinking. They're forced to guess, to assume, to interpret, and interpretation always reveals more about the interpreter than the interpreted. This is why the silent person in a room becomes magnetic. Not because they're withholding, though they are, but because they're a mirror. Everyone projects onto them what they fear, what they hope, what they need to believe. And the person who understands this can shape a room not by speaking into it, but by allowing it to speak into their silence. Think about how this plays out in practical terms. You're in a meeting where a controversial decision is being debated. The instinct most people have is to state their position early, to stake their claim, to make sure everyone knows where they stand. But what happens when you do that? You become predictable. People know how to argue with you because you've given them your position to argue against. You've limited your options because you've committed publicly to a stance. You've revealed information about your priorities, your fears, your pressure points. The Machiavellian approach is different. You listen. You watch who allies with whom. You notice who speaks from conviction and who speaks from fear. You observe which arguments gain traction and which fall flat. And while everyone else is exposing their positions, you remain unreadable. When you finally speak, you do so with complete information about the landscape. You know where the alliances are, where the weak points are, where the leverage is. Your words land with precision because you've used silence to map the terrain. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable, where we have to confront what this strategy costs us. Silence is loneliness. When you commit to speaking less and observing more, when you resist the urge to fill every pause and contribute to every discussion, you're choosing a form of isolation. People bond through shared talking, through the mutual vulnerability of putting thoughts into words and hoping they land well. When you withhold that, when you sit in your observation while others share, you're outside the circle of communal thinking. You're choosing strategy over belonging, and that choice has consequences. People often distrust the quiet one. They wonder what you're thinking, what you're planning, why you're not participating in the same way they are. They may interpret your silence as arrogance, as disengagement, as evidence that you think you're above the conversation. And sometimes they're right to be suspicious, because you are outside the flow of unconscious group dynamics, and that outsider position is exactly what gives you power. Jung would say this is the price of consciousness. The more aware you become of group dynamics, of power flows, of psychological patterns, the harder it becomes to participate in them unconsciously. You see too much. You notice how consensus forms not through careful reasoning but through social pressure, how the loudest voice often wins not because they're right but because people are tired of arguing, how meetings are less about discovering truth and more about managing egos and maintaining hierarchies. Once you see this, you can't unsee it, and your silence becomes partially strategic, yes, but also partially protective. You're preserving your own clarity in an environment where clarity is constantly under assault by noise, politics, and the compulsive need everyone has to be heard regardless of whether they have something worth saying. The emotional cost of strategic silence is real. There's a kind of grief in it. The grief of watching people exhaust themselves in verbal combat while you remain apart, seeing clearly but feeling separate. You watch someone dominate a conversation and lose respect in the process. Watch someone else reveal information they should have protected. Watch alliances form based on who talks the most rather than who thinks the deepest. And you cannot participate in the comfortable illusion that all of this talking is productive. You're aware that most of it is noise, that the real decisions will be made later in smaller conversations, that the public meeting is often theater and the private follow-up is where actual power moves. This awareness is valuable strategically, but it's isolating emotionally. You're playing a different game than everyone else in the room, and they can sense it even if they can't articulate it. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Silence creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. In any group conversation, there's a rhythm: speak, respond, speak, respond. When you break that rhythm by simply not responding, by letting your turn pass in silence, something shifts. The pressure that would have dispersed through your words remains concentrated. Others feel it. They often rush to fill the gap you've created, and in rushing, they become sloppy. They say things they didn't plan to say. They reveal tensions that were meant to stay hidden. They make concessions to ease their own discomfort with the silence you're maintaining. This is Machiavellian strategy at its purest. Using the psychological discomfort of others to gain advantage, not through aggression or domination, but through simple absence. You're not attacking anyone. You're just not participating in the expected way. And that deviation from expectation creates all the leverage you need. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power as the fundamental drive of human existence, but he didn't mean power over others. He meant power over oneself, the ability to direct one's own actions according to one's own values rather than reacting to external pressure. Strategic silence is the embodiment of this principle. Every time you resist the urge to speak when speaking would ease tension, every time you hold your position in silence while others scramble to fill the void, you're exercising power over your own impulses. You're choosing long-term strategic advantage over short-term social comfort. You're saying, I will not be moved by the pressure to perform, to contribute, to ease everyone's discomfort at the cost of my own advantage. This is self-mastery disguised as simple quiet. But let's address the obvious question. Isn't this just manipulation? Isn't strategic silence a form of emotional manipulation? Using people's discomfort against them? Wielding psychological insight as a weapon? And the answer is yes and no. Everything is manipulation if you define manipulation as influencing others' behavior. Every word you speak, every facial expression, every choice about what to reveal and what to conceal, all of it influences how others perceive and respond to you. The question isn't whether you're influencing others. You are, constantly, whether you intend to or not. The question is whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, skillfully or clumsily. in service of mutual benefit or purely selfish gain. Machiavelli has been misunderstood for 500 years as an advocate of cruelty and deception. But read The Prince carefully and you'll find something else. A manual for survival in a world where everyone is already employing strategy, where naivety is punished and awareness is rewarded. He wasn't telling leaders to be manipulative in a world of honest people. He was telling them to be strategic in a world where everyone is already being strategic, but most are doing it badly, unconsciously, wrapped in the comfortable fiction that they're above such considerations. The person who claims they never use strategy in relationships, who insists they're always authentically themselves regardless of context, is either lying or dangerously unaware. We all adjust based on our environment. We all read rooms and calibrate our responses. The question is whether we do it consciously, with clear intention and ethical boundaries, or whether we stumble through it, alternating between oversharing and shutting down, between dominating conversations and disappearing into silence, never quite sure why some interactions work and others collapse. Strategic silence becomes ethical when it serves a larger purpose than just winning. When you use silence in a meeting to ensure that the loudest voice doesn't automatically win, when you create space through your own quiet for someone else to speak who would otherwise be talked over, when you withhold immediate reaction to give yourself time to respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally, these are ethical applications of strategic silence. You're not using it to harm. You're using it to create better outcomes, to protect your own clarity in chaotic environments, to resist the pressure to participate in dynamics you recognize as destructive. The Machiavellian insight is that the world will pressure you to speak before you're ready, to commit before you're certain, to reveal before you've observed. And resisting that pressure through strategic silence isn't cruel, it's self-preservation. Consider how the most effective leaders actually operate. They rarely speak first in meetings. They create space for others to present ideas, to debate, to expose their thinking. They ask questions more than they make statements. They use silence after asking those questions, refusing to fill the pause, allowing discomfort to do the work of extracting truth. And when they finally speak, their words carry weight precisely because they've been sparse. This isn't accident. This is deliberate cultivation of what we might call strategic presence, being fully there without constantly proving you're there through noise. The insecure leader talks constantly, afraid that silence will be interpreted as ignorance or absence. The secure leader knows that silence is attention in its purest form, and that attention is the most valuable thing you can offer or withhold. Jung wrote about the concept of holding the tension of opposites, being able to contain contradictory ideas or impulses without immediately resolving them into comfortable certainty. Strategic silence is this principle in action. You're holding information without immediately processing it into speech. You're containing your reactions without immediately expressing them. You're tolerating not knowing how others perceive your silence without rushing to clarify or explain. This is psychological maturity, the ability to sit in uncertainty, in ambiguity, in the gap between stimulus and response. Most people cannot do this. The moment they think something, they say it. The moment they feel uncertain, they ask for reassurance. The moment silence becomes uncomfortable, they fill it with noise. The person who can resist these impulses has access to a kind of power that the reactive person will never understand. Here's what happens practically when you master this. You start to see patterns that others miss. Because you're not constantly formulating your next statement while others are talking, you're actually listening. You're noticing not just what people say, but how they say it, what they avoid saying, when their energy shifts, where their true concerns lie beneath their stated positions. You're reading the room at a level that's impossible when you're focused on your own performance within it. And this information becomes leverage. not in a cruel sense, but in the sense that you understand the situation more completely than those who've been talking through it. You can speak to actual concerns rather than stated positions. You can offer solutions that address real problems rather than surface symptoms. Your influence grows not because you're dominating, but because when you finally speak, you're speaking to what's actually happening rather than to the performance everyone's putting on. But the transformation required to reach this level is significant. You have to overcome years of conditioning that says your worth is measured by your verbal contribution. You have to face the discomfort of being misunderstood as disengaged when you're actually hyper-engaged in a different way. You have to accept that some people will never appreciate or understand what you're doing. They'll just think you're quiet or standoffish or less intelligent than the person who never stops talking. And you have to be okay with that. You have to value strategic advantage over social approval. You have to care more about being effective than being liked. This is Nietzsche's self-overcoming applied to communication. Becoming willing to be misunderstood in service of a deeper truth. Where does this leave you in your actual life? In the meetings you'll attend tomorrow? In the difficult conversations waiting for you next week? It leaves you with a choice. You can continue participating in the theater of constant communication, filling every silence, contributing to every discussion, proving your engagement through noise. Or you can begin experimenting with strategic silence, not as a gimmick, but as a practice of self-mastery and situational awareness. Start small. In your next meeting, try speaking half as much as you normally would. Notice what happens. Notice the discomfort that arises in you when there's a pause and you deliberately don't fill it. Notice what others reveal when you create space through silence. Notice how your eventual words land differently when they're rare rather than constant. The practice of strategic silence reveals your shadow quickly and mercilessly. If you try to stay quiet in a meeting and find it almost impossible, if the urge to speak becomes overwhelming, if silence feels like drowning, that's information. That's your shadow speaking, the part of you that believes your value is contingent on your verbal performance. Jung would tell you to befriend this part rather than fight it. Understand where it came from. Maybe you were praised as a child for being articulate, for always having an answer, for being the one who could fill uncomfortable silences. Maybe your professional success has been built on being the person who speaks up, who contributes, who's visible through vocal participation. That strategy served you then, but strategies that worked in one context can become prisons in another. The question is whether you can evolve, whether you can add silence to your repertoire without losing your ability to speak when speaking actually serves you. Here's the practical framework. Before you speak in any consequential setting, ask yourself 3 questions. First, do I have information that others lack, or am I about to repeat what's already been said in different words? Second, will my speaking move the situation toward resolution, or am I speaking to ease my own discomfort with silence? Third, what am I revealing about my position, my priorities, my pressure points by speaking now? If you can't answer these questions clearly, don't speak. Hold the silence. Observe. Let others expose their positions while you remain strategically unclear. This doesn't mean never speaking. It means speaking with intention rather than compulsion, from strategy rather than anxiety, from fullness rather than emptiness. Watch what happens when you implement this. You'll notice that meetings get shorter. When you're not contributing to the circular discussions that fill time, when you're not asking questions that have already been implicitly answered, when you're not speaking just to be seen speaking, the actual productive part of any meeting becomes obvious. You'll notice power dynamics more clearly. You'll see who actually influences outcomes versus who just makes noise. You'll observe how decisions were already made before the meeting started, and the meeting is just theater to create buy-in. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Your strategic silence shifts from being a technique to being a natural response to understanding what's actually happening. The loneliness intensifies before it resolves. When you first start employing strategic silence, you feel separate from the group in an uncomfortable way. You're aware that you're playing a different game, operating from a different level of awareness. Others sense this too, even if they can't name it. They may ask if you're okay, if something's wrong, why you're being so quiet. This is projection. Your silence is reflecting back their own discomfort with quiet, their own compulsive need to fill space. Don't explain. Don't justify. Just offer a simple, "I'm listening," or "I'm thinking." And then return to your silence. Over time, something shifts. People start seeking out your opinion specifically because you don't offer it constantly. Your words carry more weight because they're selective. You're no longer part of the noise, you've become the signal. Nietzsche wrote, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." Strategic silence is dancing to music that others can't hear, the rhythm of power dynamics, the melody of unspoken tensions, the harmony of what's actually happening beneath what's being said. You're responding to a reality that's invisible to those caught up in the performance of constant communication. And yes, they'll think you're strange. They'll wonder what you're doing. They'll sometimes resent the power your silence gives you, the way it makes their constant talking seem desperate by contrast. But you're not responsible for their comfort. You're responsible for your own effectiveness, your own clarity, your own strategic position in situations that matter. The integration happens when strategic silence stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like truth. When it's no longer something you're doing to gain advantage, but simply the natural expression of someone who's done the internal work of knowing themselves clearly enough that they don't need constant external validation through verbal performance. When you've integrated your shadow, the parts that feared invisibility, that equated silence with worthlessness, that believed your value came from being heard, then silence becomes easy. It's not strategic anymore, it's just real. You speak when speaking serves truth, connection, clarity, progress. You're silent when silence serves observation, wisdom, power, peace. And you know the difference without having to think about it. Here's the paradox that Machiavelli understood but rarely stated explicitly. The most powerful form of control is the control no one notices. When you dominate through silence, when you influence through observation, when you shape outcomes by carefully choosing when to speak rather than filling every moment with your voice, no one can point to what you're doing and call it manipulation. Because from the outside, you're just quiet. You're just thoughtful. You're just someone who doesn't feel the need to prove themselves through constant contribution. But from the inside, you're conducting the orchestra. You're watching the chessboard. You're reading the room at a level that gives you advantage in every exchange. This is the ultimate Machiavellian strategy. Power that looks like restraint, control that looks like humility, dominance that wears the mask of simple presence. The world is full of noise. Every room you enter, physical or virtual, is filled with people desperate to be heard, convinced that their worth is measured by their visibility, terrified that silence means erasure. And into that chaos, you can walk differently. You can enter knowing that your power doesn't come from adding to the noise. It comes from being the stillness in the center of it, the person others talk around, talk to, talk for, without realizing that by talking, they're giving you everything you need to know about how to influence what comes next. You stop speaking to prove you're there. You speak only when your words will change what's there. And in that discrimination, in that careful calibration of when silence serves and when speech serves, you access a level of strategic power that the compulsive communicator will never reach. Not because you're smarter, not because you're more charismatic, but because you understand what Machiavelli knew 5 centuries ago and what most people still refuse to accept. In any room where decisions matter, the person who controls the silence controls the room. If these ideas resonate with you, if you're ready to explore the deeper psychology of power, influence, and self-mastery, subscribe to Cultoro. We're just getting started on this journey from noise to signal, from performance to presence, from unconscious reaction to strategic mastery.